And a big welcome this evening to the Blavatnik School of Government. I'm Nairi Woods, Dean of the school. And tonight we're thrilled to have here with us Nick Lovegrove. Nick was one of the inaugural cohort of the Master of Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School a few years ago, let's say.
Last year.
And then has had a career working in both public and private sector. He was an advisor to the strategy unit of the Prime Minister's office of number 10 Downing Street. He was for a long time a partner at McKinsey's and was their managing partner in Washington, D.C., building the public sector practice for McKinsey's. He spent time as a consultant at Albright, and now he is managing partner for Brunswick in Washington, D.C. But he's here tonight because he's written this wonderful book, The Mosaic Principle, The 6 Dimensions of a Successful Life and Career. Is it the American version that has the 6 dimensions of a remarkable life and career?
I know, it's
Nick?
a funny thing, as the publisher decided they didn't like the word remarkable in Britain. I don't know why. I learned through this process, and you know from publishing your books, that there's a certain point at which you just hand over everything to the publisher and they just say, we'll take it from here.
Yes.
And that relates to the cover and indeed into the title, so I played no part in that.
So who of you want a remarkable life and career, and which of you want a successful life and career?
Or both.
So hands up for the remarkable.
I like remarkable.
And hands up for the successful. Yes, so
there you go, we're going for remarkable.
Big majority for remarkable in this room.
I'm very happy with that.
But tell us, and I'm going to open straight into your questions of Nick Lovegrove, but just to start, what are the 6 dimensions of a remarkable life or a successful life and career for those, for the minority that wanted that?
Well, I've scribbled some notes down because you told me you were going to ask that, and I knew I wouldn't get to 6 without...
Right.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Nairi, to you for inviting me here today at the launch of the book, and to everybody for being here. As you know, I feel like a member of the extended family of the Blavatnik School from way, way back before ever there was, long before there was a building or indeed anything. and it's been a wonderful journey to observe, and to be here now with so many of you is terrific. And it has played a role in my own thinking and wanting to write a book, because I really did want to sort of have something to say to people like yourselves about the challenges of building a career in today's world, which I think is, a complex world and challenging for many of us. And the essence of what I wanted to talk about in the book was that I think really remarkable lives come from doing a range of things and building a range of experiences and points of reference, rather than simply pursuing one ad infinitum. But I also wanted to observe how difficult that is to do. I as you described, have tried in a very imperfect way to straddle the worlds of business, of government, and the non-profit sector, play some kind of role in each, participate in each, sometimes in sequence, often in parallel. When I first moved to Washington, and I coined the expression triple play, which is a baseball term, to define our strategy, because I wanted us to be working in the public, private and non-profit sector, and I would sometimes walk from a business headquarters to a government building to a non-profit operation in the same day. I'd call that a triple play day. And what I found in trying to do that is some remarkable people, that word again, who were trying to do that as well. But I also found that it was difficult to do, and there were challenges in taking that on. And I wanted to talk about that, use the examples of people that I had come across, or that I read about, or interviewed, or researched, to explain just how to take on that challenge. And I did find these common themes kept on cropping up, and I've been working on this now for 4 or 5 years, and those themes have remained pretty much the same throughout. And the first is, and you and I were just talking about this, that there are people who had to establish a very clear moral compass, a very clear sense of right and wrong, because when you participate in different arenas and at the intersection of them, you're often faced with real ethical issues and conflicts. You're involved in what I call areas of moral complexity, the sort of revolving door concept, which has become to be a pejorative term. And you have to know who you are, and you have to know what you believe in and what's right. So I think that's been a very common theme. I think the second very common theme has been a really thoughtful approach to balancing specialization with general knowledge, with general experience. The Mosaic Principle, which is all about building this mosaic life, this life of variety, is not about just doing whatever you feel like at any time and hope that you'll get away with it. You do need to have areas of expertise, areas of focus, but you also need to put them in a broader context. I mean, I can obviously say more about each of these. I think the idea of contextual intelligence is a really important one, which is when you move between different walks of life, how quickly can you adapt to the different contexts of the changing environment in which you're operating, and how quickly can you absorb what really matters in that environment and respond to it. The fourth is extended networks. I'm probably not doing these in the same order in the book, but it kind of doesn't matter. Extended networks, I think, is a very interesting thing. When you move between different walks of life, you come across all sorts of different kinds of people, and you're not entirely sure where they all fit into your life. But over time, you start to realize that as you solve problems, as you build teams, as you develop perspectives, the variety of people that you can draw upon with different experiences and different perspectives, and that's a really valuable thing. Transferable skills. Transferable skills is all about establishing a base of skills that is relevant and applicable in different settings. When you go from business into government, there is a lot that you've learned from business that is relevant to government. You can use some of the problem-solving techniques, some of the approaches that you've developed in business to solving government problems. There are other aspects of government that are very different from business, and you have to be aware of that as well. But establishing what that foundation of transferable skills is really important. And then the final one, and perhaps the most important of all, particularly when you're in a sort of early stage of your career, or formative stage of your career, is a prepared mind. And that's really all about saying, I don't know exactly how my life is going to work out. I don't have a career plan as such. But I do know what's important to me. I do know the kinds of things I'd like to do in my life. I do know the kinds of choices I'd like to be prepared for. And I am prepared to, I'm going to be ready for that. And a very good example is knowing that at some point in your life you want to be involved in public service. That may not be the first thing you do, or it may be. But if it's not the first thing you do, you want to be ready for that opportunity when it comes along, and you don't want to be surprised by that and think, oh, no, I don't know what to do about that. You want to have a mindset that's ready for that challenge. So those are the 6 dimensions that I came across most regularly in the people that I found were building this remarkable life.
And then, just before I turn for your questions, what about when they're in tension? What about, and in your book you have examples of this, but what about when you do need to expand your network, but the colleague you need to expand your network is someone you know to be a shady character? So your moral compass is actually at odds with your ambition and your career and the seemingly necessary move that you need to make.
Yeah, well, I think conflict is at the heart of this. I mean, tough choices and recognizing that there are real risks in the kind of people you deal with and the kind of situations you're in. You and I were talking about a relationship that I had with a counterpart who I sort of gradually realized was not somebody I really could trust. And I too late made the decision to sort of sever ties with that person, and I wished I'd done it earlier. And having had that experience once, I hope I wouldn't make the same mistake again. A lot of this is based on the kinds of experiences you've had. I don't want to over-dramatize this too much, but I have had highly respected colleagues of mine, people I thought were tremendous people, not only go badly wrong, but end up in jail as a result. In the most extreme case, the worldwide managing partner of McKinsey, during a good part of my time there, ended up going to jail. Not as it happens for something he did at McKinsey, but nevertheless a serious crime, insider trading. And that is the kind of thing that gives you pause to say, well, I was part of the same institution as him. Indeed, he was leading it. With what was going on, and that's a tough thing to be part of.
But practically, where do you draw that line? Because you've spent a life as an advisor, a consultant, services companies. If you refuse to work with people that are shady, frankly, you don't have a business model, right? So how do you manage that? Is there do you mentally have a red line and say, I'll do this for this person or this company or this organization, but not that? Or do you say, I won't deal with them at all? What's the ideal and what do you do in practice?
I've always tried to take a pretty independent line about what I would work on and with whom, without being necessarily puritanical. For instance, I've said there's certain kinds of industries I wouldn't work in, and certain kinds of business I just didn't want to do, and by definition, by implication, certain people I just didn't. If you're in a large enough institution, you can navigate your way around that because you have quite a lot of freedom about who you work with, and increasingly, the more senior you get, a lot of freedom. And I suppose I've just tried to take the approach of I want to do it my way. I mean, I want to put my own imprint on this. But when I reflect back on it, I've made some mistakes myself, and I tried to be honest about that in the book and say, there were moments when I should have made different decisions, and I wish I had.
I mean, I remember being given the advice, life is too short to work with people who are not great, right? Would that be your advice, or would you say, actually, you're going to have to work?
Yeah, I think that's probably too extreme because that would set a very high bar. But insofar as you have the power to influence with whom you work, you obviously want to work with people who not only you can trust, but who energize and excite you. One of the great pleasures about moving between business and government and non-profit world is you're able to work with different kinds of people motivated by different objectives, who you learn from in a very different way. I talk in the book, for instance, in many ways, one of the most inspirational people I worked with was not in business or in government. He was the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Now, I had the good fortune, by almost complete serendipity, of ending up on the board of the Royal Shakespeare Company for 6 years, between 2000 and 2006. And when I started there on the board, largely the reason they asked me on the board is they were in terrible trouble. The economics were completely messed up. They had a terrible PR problem around the fact that they wanted to rebuild the theatres in Stratford, and that was causing all sorts of local difficulty in Stratford. The government were about to pull their grant from the Royal Shakespeare Company, which would have completely destroyed the company. And the artistic director was more or less on his last legs. And I was able to see a complete turnaround by virtue of the appointment of a new artistic director and executive director, and a complete change. And this was somebody who'd worked in the theatre his whole life, spent most of his life directing plays, never really run anything before. But he found that by a very rigorous sense of what's right, but a very pragmatic approach to finance, that he was going to get the finances of the business sorted out. He was even going to. The fact that he would talk about it as a business in itself was quite a big thing, because and it was an amazing transformation. And I think you all see now, the Royal Shakespeare Company is in very hearty good health. It did transform the theatres. All the theatres in Stratford are now in pretty good shape. This guy's name's Michael Boyd. He's now stepped down. And when you deal with inspirational people like that from a different walk of life than the one you're normally in, it's just an extraordinary experience, and that's been my good fortune to deal with that kind of people.
Great. Your questions. So, Addy, you've got a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick.
And do introduce yourself.
My name is Ade. I'm an MPP candidate. I'd like to first commend you on the book. It's well written. You know, I just started it this morning, and I think I find it difficult to put down. But my question is about, you know, legitimacy for between the expert and the generalist. You talked about in your book about how some of the crises the world has witnessed in the last, say, 2 decades, both the global financial crisis and even some of the backlash we're seeing politically is like stems from like the crisis of the, from so much emphasis on expertise. You know, the experts have failed us. You know, we're starting to see some of those backlash now. My question is, how do generalists, you know, how do they start to win legitimacy to say what I have is I'm a generalist. I have a view of several fields, you know, several disciplines. Yeah. How do they win legitimacy in the public space? You know, and then just one more thing. Sorry. How do we encourage society to start to also incentivize generalist knowledge and not only specialist skills? Yeah.
No, you're exactly right. I do try in the book to lay out the risks of over-specialization or ultra-specialization, as I call it. And I think this is, I would say, a relatively recent phenomenon, the degree to which specialists have become the dominant force in most of our institutions. I would say in my lifetime, in my career, and I think it's accelerated. And I'm not alone in thinking that. I mean, I think in medicine you see people concerned about that. The academic world, there's issues around that. Certainly the professional services world that I grew up in, and finance. And what I argue in the book is that the successive financial crises, not just the 2008 financial crisis, but a series of breakdowns in financial companies and financial systems, right the way through to Wells Fargo last year, have come from over-reliance on people who could only and could only operate in a narrow sliver of activity. But because ultra-specialization has also combined with increased technical capacity and at scale, they've been able to bring not just companies down, but whole systems down. And there was nobody there to stop them, because, frankly, there was nobody who understood what they were doing. The people who were supposedly in charge of supervising them, whether they be the senior management or the regulators, they didn't understand what they were doing. And that became painfully apparent afterwards. And all the diagnostics of the financial crisis since have demonstrated that fundamental problem of overdependence on technical specialists and under the lack of capability of the people who are supervising them. So I think we have to do a major reinforcement of that broad-minded and multidimensional capability in so many institutions. Now, I don't love the term generalist. Also, I'll probably use it just for the lack of anything else. But because I think it can be implied to just mean, almost dilettante. You don't need to know. I think the kind of people who are running, they need to know a lot. I mean, they need to have very substantial knowledge. But it can't be that that we can't depend entirely on this very thin sliver of knowledge, and that's, I think, the pendulum has swung. It's swung a long way, as pendulums tend to do. It's swung too far. I think it needs to swing back.
But Nick, I don't quite understand the implication for banks, because either the managers have to be ultra specialists as well, or you're saying they shouldn't hire any ultra specialists. But that's unlikely, surely.
But I do think banks have belatedly realised that they can't go as far as they were going in allowing the ultra specialists free rein, and that has required a sort of re-education of, if you like, the management layer, the management task. They do need to know more about what their people are doing. There need to be more checks and balances. And, of course, there need to be more safety nets. I mean, that's the other thing that, of course, has been realised, is that these are people who are putting whole systems at risk, and we can't allow that to happen.
Does that answer? Yeah. Yes. Hi.
Thanks, Nick. Ellie from Australia. We've seen a backlash against liberal elitism, and for us as graduates, and I'm an MPP student here, we get a warning that says to have an impact, get outside of your liberal elite bubble. Yeah. But then we look at career options, and often the ones that seem to have the best networks, the best stepping stones, are in the usual kind of consulting, finance, and quite elite career tracks. So what would be your advice if you're a graduate wanting a remarkable career and wanting to make an impact, but also understanding that a lot of the best networks are in those elite bubbles? What would you do?
Gosh.
Great question.
It is a great question. Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge the importance of the question, which is that a big part of the problem that so many of us have gotten into is that we have been living our lives in quite narrow cocoons, if you like, and we have not been exposed to enough differences of experience and environment so that we've been taken by surprise by things that we haven't known how to react. So I think we can and need to acknowledge that we've made some serious mistakes as a consequence, and we're now, to some degree, seeing the consequences of that. It's been encapsulated. Elites is rather like the word generalist. It's a sort of, it's a difficult word to wrap your arms around, because if it's interpreted as don't pursue professional excellence, don't invest in education, don't seek to achieve professional aspirations, that feels a very implausible basis upon which to run any kind of society. But it does mean, but I think the more productive way of thinking about it is that in any line of work, in any profession, we can and need to get out of our bubble and try to engage in others. So I think, for instance, just to pick an example from the very top of one business, Mark Zuckerberg's sort of response to this is, which I think has been interpreted as a political response, but I think it's a genuine response, which is to try to engage with people in lots of states and get out of the Silicon Valley bubble. He perceives the problem as being the Silicon Valley elite, and I think he's probably right, that there is almost a cone of silence or a dome around Silicon Valley. And you asked the question in the context of, well, then what professional choices do you make? And that's a really difficult one for me. I mean, I first of all, I don't know how to advise on that. But I suppose to my mind, it's less about whether you join elite institutions, because ultimately you'll end up working for you'll want to be part of high-performing enterprises, whether they're existing or you help to establish them. But whatever you can do in those places to connect with different sources of reference, and the degree to which you move between them and you take things with you, I think that's the key to this. But this is a challenge we're all facing at the moment. I mean, it's a very hard thing if you're now in an institution that's dedicated to excellence and intelligence, and if you live and work in those kind of places, how do you adapt? I don't think leaving them is the answer. I think helping them to adapt is the answer.
And also, if I can add a footnote, there's nothing new about the cosmopolitan elite going to countries and communities it does not know, and forcing on them solutions that are blind and deaf to what that community itself actually wants or needs. It's just that it's happening in our own back door, and so we're starting to see it. But I think the lessons have been learned and relearned or ignored and re-ignored for a long time, and that there are some organisations that do it better than others and some that are trying to retool now, so you can join those.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people I talk about in the book is Paul Farmer, and Paul in many ways is an absolute manifestation of an elite. He's a highly skilled surgeon. He's trained in the best medical places in the world. He's now a leading consultant at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And if that was all there was to Paul, then you'd say, great, but, you know, he's part of this elite. But he has made a series of choices, starting very early on, to expose himself to different circumstances, more challenging circumstances, in his case initially in Haiti, and having learnt from those experiences, try to do something about them, not just in Haiti but beyond. And he made, and the interesting thing is he created a kind of a virtuous circle, because he ended up being a better doctor by virtue of the experiences he had in Haiti, but he also ended up being a more powerful institutional influencer and policymaker by virtue of having a foundation, you know, having a platform in Boston, at Harvard, and build from there. And he now has, in Partners in Health, an enterprise with 18,000 employees around the world, and a really powerful position in which to influence the direction of medical policy around the world, and then that's played out in other ways as well. So his approach, I suppose, was to try to retain the excellence of elite institutions, to ally the excellence of elite institutions to the needs and interests of a broader public.
Great. Lisa?
My name is Lisa. I'm from Ukraine, MPP student here. And I have a question. How do you think how to combine ability to listen to people, but in the same time to take leadership and responsibility in decision-making for them in the right time? So not to be late if you are a politician and you need to solve a problem, but in the same time not to cross that red line of and not to become authoritarian. Following this, also how to deal with the criticism here. What should be your personal approach of that remarkable person, and not to become, not to create that censor, actually.
So I want to make sure I understand the second part of the question. What do you mean by censor?
Well, I'm saying that there are a lot of examples in history of people who are very good leaders, but they just because they don't like criticism, they create censoring, and they just don't allow, I don't know, others to criticize them.
Yeah.
There might be two sides of the same question. So how not to be an authoritarian, tempting as it is.
Yeah. So, well, it's a very pertinent subject at the moment, right? And I think we're all having to try to figure out not only, what the new American administration is all about, but also how to deal with it, and how to deal with it from different perspectives, whether you're directly involved in it or not. I mean, Irene and I were talking about earlier about if you're a career civil servant in the federal government of the United States right now, you have got a very significant challenge on your hands. You can walk away, and some will, some have, and say, I don't want to deal with this. Or you can say, no, I'm in this, for a reason, and I've got to figure out how to use my position to influence this direction. But to go back to your starting point, you put the emphasis on listening and understanding, and I do too. And in my chapter on contextual intelligence, I really focus on the power of listening and the power of asking questions as a means of, and I think about it in two senses. One is curiosity as a guiding concept, if you like, is actually genuinely wanting to understand and being willing to go, and it relates to the last question, in a way, really trying to understand what forces are at work and finding the people who can help you understand that better. For obvious reasons, if one only spends time with the people who agree with you, then you're going to miss a lot of things. if you only spend time with people who have the same experience as you, you're going to miss a lot of things. So the whole essence of my book is don't do that. You know, find people who don't agree with you, find people who have very different perspectives. And the second is have an organized framework for asking questions and listening to the answers. I talk in the book about a fellow called Bernie Ferrari, who was a colleague of mine for a while, had the best name, I always thought. And he was, before he was my colleague, he was a doctor and a heart surgeon, and he talks about the medical approach to diagnostic, to asking questions, which I think is a very good framework to draw upon. And Atul Gawande, who I talk about in the book, who wrote the Checklist Manifesto and other books, he again emphasizes this theme of having a really good structured way of asking questions. And some of those questions can be very much, very direct, you know, does it hurt here? But some of them can be much more contextual. How long have you been feeling poorly? Have you been in a place where you might be exposed to certain conditions, and so on? And just you thinking about, well, how do you get to find out what's going on? What are the kinds of questions you ask? What's the framework of questions? So that when you go into a new setting, you can figure that out. Only when you've done that can you, with confidence, lead. I always feel like I spent my life being an advisor, but the amount of time I've actually spent giving advice is fairly limited. I talk to regulators, and I say, well, how much time do you spend regulating? And they say, not very much. Most of the time they're preparing for the moment when they might have to make a decision either in the round or in a very specific setting. And I think similarly, leadership is something you largely do by example and by asking the right questions. And then when the moment comes, making a well-informed decision. But it's not something you're doing every day, every hour, every minute, except in most walks of life.
I'm going to take another question, Lisa. Do you guys want to just pass it along? Yeah, lovely.
Hi, Richa. I'm also an MPP candidate here from India.
Oh, I should say I'm an MPP from a long time ago, very proudly. So I'm a huge believer in the whole concept of the MPP program. So.
Studying for government. Yeah. If I may just push you a little bit on what you said in the beginning of the earlier answer. So earlier you talked about drawing lines in the commercial world in terms of the networks you have.
Yeah.
And you also said you should be ready for public service when it arrives, don't be surprised by it. But what if it, the ability to serve comes at a morally challenging time, and for a government that is whose morals are in conflict with yours?
Well, I mean, you wouldn't do it in those circumstances. I think there are going to be times when it's very obvious that what the decision is, but what I try to talk about in the book is when it's less obvious, when either you can't immediately tell whether you're in sympathy with the government or whether you're going to be asked to do it. So I think it's those areas of moral complexity that I find most difficult in life. Again, I go back to, I think that's really what I want to say about it. Is there are times when it's a very easy decision. I don't agree with these guys. They're not. But let's put it in this context of because you and I were talking about this. Should a federal employee in the US today resign from the government because they don't agree with the direction of the Trump administration? I think must be an incredibly difficult decision for a lot of people. I mean, I live in Washington, and just put this in the context. 4% of the population of Washington, D.C. voted for Donald Trump. 93% voted against him. That's a very high proportion of the population of Washington, D.C. are federal employees. Northern Virginia and Southern Maryland are the same, and similar voting patterns. So, this administration that he's now building is operating in hostile territory, if you like. and it's not just, and I'm just sort of, I think, expanding upon the concept that you're laying out. It's not just that they voted against in some, on balance. They voted with passion against. They fundamentally didn't believe in the principles, and indeed the morals of. I think this must be the hardest decision ever for a federal employee right now, to stick with it or to try to get out. Some have already chosen to get out. Some have enabled themselves to be fired. And others are going to face this choice. And I think this is going to be one of the stories of the new administration. But you were saying, and I think you're right, of course, part of what he wants is for people to get out of the way. And that's very hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have sort of, it depends what you're wanting to do. If you're wanting actually to restrain the president, you're better to stay in your job and use it to restrain the president, because it's actually quite difficult to fire hundreds and hundreds of federal employees, so tie them up in that process. If you're just disagreeing with the general direction of policy in some general way, then of course you can resign. And then if you're thinking, well, it's my duty to serve, you still need red lines, and we've talked about that in other sessions. You should have a red line, which is, if I'm asked to do something illegal, or if I'm asked to do this, I will resign. And I think knowing your red line is really important.
I agree with that, and I think for a lot of people there will be moments of truth in the coming weeks, months, and/or years. I think the offsetting factor in this is there are a significant number of roles in government that I don't want to say they're apolitical, and that they're not influenced by the political direction of the government, but the mission remains under almost any administration. If you're trying to enhance the health of the nation, or trying to enhance the housing stock of the nation, or if you're trying to improve the roads, or if you're trying to do a variety of these things, whilst the rhetoric of politics can imply massive differences in approach, in the actual application of a lot of what you're doing, the differences can be more modest. I mean, politics amplifies differences. I mean, that's what it's there for, in a sense, to make stark choices, make stark differences. When you are, I mean, I started working with the federal government in Washington in 2006, into 2007, and also all through the last two and a half years of the Bush administration, and then through the Obama administration. And whilst clearly they were fundamentally different governments with very different philosophies, a good part of the work was the same. And I was struck by the self-sustaining mission of the government employees. I think the Trump administration sets a whole new bar of challenge complexity.
But Nick, can I press you? So if you were working in the Trump administration now on the infrastructure plan, which needs really good technical expertise, I know people are going in for it, this could be a real opportunity. So you personally are in there working on the infrastructure, and then in a different domain of policy, it might be refugee policy, or it might be defense policy around torture. The government that you are serving as a political appointee makes a decision that you think is morally unacceptable.
Yeah.
So what do you do then? What would you personally do
Well, I
then?
think you set up exactly the dilemma that many people will feel. And actually, I think is also a political dilemma, for instance, for the Democrats. I mean, they would love to see infrastructure. They've been hoping for infrastructure investment, and they, to some degree, hoped that Trump would be an infrastructure president. And I think they were certainly interested in exploring that. But I think even in the first few days, they see the moral complexity, if you like, of trying to collaborate with a government. Speaking personally, I think I would be guided by the higher concern, if you like, the moral concern. I think I would just personally find it very difficult to work for a president who's just morality I just didn't want to accept or be part of. But you know, that's for the moment a theoretical choice for me. I can say that because I'm not having to make that decision. For many, it will be a very challenging decision. And you have to remember, you know, career civil servants are not people with all the noise in government in America is around the 4,000 political appointees. They are, by definition, people who are highly mobile. The very act of going into government is a decision based on mobility. That they can make choices, and they know that they're there for a period of time, and then they'll move on, and so on. The American system is built on that. But for career civil servants, this is what they do, and it's a much harder thing to move out of it.
Great. Next question. Or you're allowed to give your own view of the moral dilemma that we put to Nick, if you've got a different answer to it. No, but the next question, Hannah.
Thanks very much. Really enjoying the talk and very encouraged to hear that you think there's still a role for generalists. My question is about how are you defining remarkable, and to you, what is the definition of a remarkable career, and does that necessitate being in a position of influence? Because it strikes me that some people don't set out to, some of the most influential people haven't necessarily set out with that as their goal. And do you think that one you need to aim towards being in a position of influence, which means playing the game and, as Ellie was saying, being part of those networks? Or, obviously, you're going to do all of this with a grounding of wanting to be in public service, but do you still think that seeking a position of power has to be part of being able to do that?
So I'll try to peel away at that. I would want the emphasis to be on the impact that one has had during one's career, that one has had a positive impact, and hopefully at some scale. And you know, what I talk about in the book is trying to put yourself in the position many years down the road of looking back on your career and saying, what do I feel proud of? What am I glad I did? What mistakes did I make? But fundamentally, did I achieve some impact? I'm at a stage in my life and career where I am looking back quite a bit. Also, I'm looking forward as well, because, by the way, one of the themes of the book is we have much more time than we thought we were going to have, and we should use it, including the later years. But the most important thing that I look back on is, did positive, meaningful things happen as a consequence? By the way, I think this is indicative of the degree to which the word remarkable is superior to the word successful. And I think that was reflected in the vote in the group. Is success may be a feature of a remarkable life, but it's not the whole of a remarkable life. Part of what comes from a remarkable life is exposure to fascinating things and a curious mind that makes you want to keep learning, and the excitement of dealing with people of very different experiences and disciplines from your own. Those are elements of remarkable life that are not directly defined by success. To have that kind of life, to have a life of impact, to be able to look back and say, I did achieve something and made a difference, do you need to have influence? Yes, I think it's almost that's the equation to me, and influence. But influence can come in so many different ways. One of the kinds of people who really interested me are people who've trained in a particular discipline, like to be a doctor or a surgeon, and then have moved into another walk of life, whether it be politics or public service or professional services. And they've made that choice because they wanted to have impact at greater scale. They said, well, as a doctor or a lawyer, I can only deal with one case at a time. I want to be able to deal with the totality of cases. I think the benign reason to go into politics is to have positive influence at scale. And I would always want to believe, especially speaking here in a school that has government at the end of its name, that that was a good thing to aim for, and that we should always want people to do that. So I think my answer to your question is yes on all dimensions, but that's the way I would describe the narrative.
I can't help but ask you, Nick, at what point, well, I guess that would be a bit like therapy, so we won't ask that question, but I met a doctor the other day, and I asked him, did he enjoy being a doctor? And he said, no, he hated it. He'd only just finished his training. So I said, well, why on earth did you train to be a doctor? And he said, because my mother really wanted me to. But you said, think about what you will feel proud of. How do you screen out what other people in your life will feel proud of you? How do you screen out oh, my mother, my father, my grandmother, my auntie, my cousin would be so proud of me if I could ring them and tell them that I've just been made managing director, you know. How do you screen that out and work out what's actually what you're proud of?
I'm a bad person to answer this because both my parents were teachers and they thought I should be a teacher, and the fact that I wasn't a teacher they'll never appreciate anything I've done. So, and my brother is a teacher, which makes it even worse. We are the subject of our influences, and I had just to make it personal, a very pleasant experience last night in that we had a launch event for my book in London, and my father was there, and my father, as I said, was a school teacher, a headmaster in a comprehensive school in Britain. But 53 years ago, when he was studying for a diploma in education, he wrote a dissertation on the risks of over-specialisation in education. And he included a quote about something like, and the evidence as to why this is a valuable thing is completely unproven. And when I told him I was writing this book, he went out and he found a copy of this dissertation and gave it to me, and I included it in my book in the early stages of the book. So I had the great pleasure of quoting my own father in my book. And I suppose that's indicative of the fact that parental influences and influences of others in family and so on are really profound and really important. I'm fortunate in that, by and large, all those influences have been very benign, and that everything has been all up to me.
But I think there's a difference, though, between what the world applauds, and I think this was in Hannah's question, which is that there are people who have had huge impact at scale, but have not spent huge amounts of time selling themselves.
Yeah.
And there are people who have actually had much less impact at much less scale, but have invested hugely in selling themselves.
Yeah.
And the world would see the latter as remarkable.
Yes, I agree. You talked about how do you filter out those less positive influences, or the influences that lead you to spend time doing something you really don't want to do. And I think that's why we are in places like this, is because we're trying to find who we are and what we want to do, and to try to be able to draw the best influences from the people who matter to us. It's sort of hard to, it's fascinating what you described. It's sort of hard to imagine going through all the pain and rigour of becoming a doctor and not really want to do it. But it happens, right? And I think we just have to acknowledge it does happen. If that can happen, then we need to be sensitive to that risk and have that that's part of our prepared mind, I guess.
Right, but how do you deal with the other case? So you're working for a boss in an NGO or in politics who spends their whole time working on their public image, and none of their time on their actual job. I mean, I've had a number of very dear friends and colleagues come to kind of ask advice on this in the last 10 days.
Can I build my brand?
So what is the advice? You're working for this person who's spending too much time on their own image and too little time on the job that they're supposed to be doing.
But that's a question about how should you respond to those people.
Yeah, so when you're working for such a person as an advisor, as a consultant, as an employee, how do you manage that?
I don't know. That's incredibly difficult. I suppose I'm trying to tie this back to the book, because the book is really all about how do you create your own life and reduce your dependence upon how other people define remarkable, if you like. I mean, you know, the whole essence of this book is it's about taking a conscious approach to your life, recognizing the realities and the challenges that you're going to face, and determining what matters to you. And if you're confronted with a situation or find yourself in a situation where you don't like the influences being placed upon you, doing as much as you can to reshape that environment. If you can, then if you can't, then moving on. And that's the navigating part. I call it the motivation map. That's navigating our motivations to achieve the best results in our terms.
Last couple of questions. Gal.
Thank you very much. I'm Gal from Israel, also an MPP student. So most of us have some professional experience.
Yeah.
And the biggest practical question that we're facing now is what to do when we will finish the program.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, what do you think should be the most important criteria according to which we choose what we're going to do in the first 2-3 years finishing school?
So I suppose the fundamental question that you face when you're here is how to apply what you have learnt here. Where is going to be the environment that's going to give you the best chance of applying? Because the decision you made to come here was clearly based upon an assessment of where you've got to in your life and what you want to be exposed to. I imagine coming here you want to be exposed to a greater understanding of the challenges and opportunities of government in an eclectic international setting, surrounded by very smart people who are thinking in similar ways, and with the foundation of, and you wanted the credential, if you like, of that you had gone through that process and that it had changed you, not turned you from one person to a completely different person, but adapted you as a person. And I suppose the sort of what follows from that is, well, what kind of decision rules does that give you in determining what you do next and what you do further down the line? Because this is, you know, the first decision you take will be important, but there'll be other decisions that will follow on from that. And in the book, I try to lay out some examples of how people approach this. Some, for instance, take the approach of, well, I'm going to be in government when the people of my political stripe are in government, and the rest of the time I'm going to do something else. I'll be in business, or I'll be in the non-profit world, and I'll move, you know, so they consciously take quite a mobile approach. Some people actually lay out sort of almost a timing of that. I call it the 4+4+4 formula. You say, I'm going to change jobs every 4 years, or change roles every 4 years, and I want to be always preparing for that. The first decision you'll have is whether to go into government, of course. I mean, this is, I think, the biggest challenge for students of government schools all over the world. I know it is at the Kennedy School, because if you've essentially somebody gone through a training process for government, you want to apply it as quickly as possible. But it isn't always, the circumstances aren't always ideal to do so. But there are a variety of different forms of government. National government, state and local government, multinational government, and there are all sorts of options around there. I feel less equipped to advise on an immediate decision about what to do next. I feel better equipped to talk about how you think about these things in terms of decision rules for life, and then this place will have been really foundational as you do. I know my experience was in shaping who... I found myself 20 years later drawing upon things that I had learned, well, still find drawing upon things that I learned, in my case, at the Kennedy School. So this is not a one-off phenomenon. This is going to influence the rest of your life.
The nice thing about decision rules is you can keep them and remind yourself 5 years later, oh, that's why I did that. And
yeah.
I wasn't stupid. I was just deciding on those criteria. Just let me take... You know what? I'm going to take these three. Well, let's take all three comments, one after the other. And I will give pen and paper to Nick.
Thank you.
So that he can pay due heed to all of them.
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for your talk. I am Tejas, and I'm from India. I'm also an MPP student here. You mentioned about a prepared mind, and in one of your 6 points, and also in the Q&A a couple of times. but I wanted to ask that despite howsoever we being prepared, there would always be circumstances for which we are unprepared. And how does one deal with those circumstances when you're unprepared or, say, unknown unknowns? Thank you so much.
Great question.
Hello, my name is Vivian. I'm from Namibia and Nigeria. I wanted to ask a cultural question. So I come from a culture that sort of prioritizes community over the individual. And there's this notion that, you are because we are. And I wanted to find out whether you felt like some of the notions that we've heard about a remarkable life, about success, how do they fit into a structure where the community's wants or the community's desires are prioritized over that of the individual?
Thank you, Nick, for the talk, and also thank you for coming to speak to us. My name is Erod Muguza. I'm a student here. My question is around the role of money or wealth, either as a catalyst or an inhibitor to living a remarkable life.
Thank you. So the first question about what happens when something that you're not prepared for happens. I don't want to just play on words, but I think a big part of having a prepared mind is being ready for the thing you're not prepared for. Being conscious that there are black swan events in life, positive and negative, and having some readiness for that. David Brooks, the very influential New York Times columnist, who I talk about quite a bit in the book, he says the one thing that he wishes education would focus more on is how hard life is, and how bad things happen, and how you're going to have to be prepared for that, and know that when that happens, to have a mindset about that. But I'd equally say, even when good things happen that are you want to be prepared for that too. I talk in the book about Michael Ignatieff, and I'm sure knows the story, who from a lifetime in the academic world and in broadcasting, so was suddenly given the opportunity to be thrust into Canadian politics, and ended up in very short order running for and winning the election for the Liberal Party in the Canadian election in 2011. This story doesn't end happily because he lost in a humiliating fashion, but he tells this extraordinary story of how he just took this opportunity for which he was completely unprepared, and is glad he did, because he had a remarkable experience. He's had a more remarkable life as a consequence. And I think if you can take that approach of this may not work, but I've decided to give it a go, then that's a dimension of being prepared, if you like. Being prepared for the fact that things are hard, and being prepared for failure. Those are two necessary conditions of a remarkable life, I think. The community, I've written a book that's about individuals, and you're right to observe that. It's about your life as an individual. But I spent my whole life in communities, and I'm very conscious that it's impossible to have a remarkable life if you simply occupy your own space. You'll either be intensely isolated or intensely unhappy. So I think a big part of building a remarkable life is finding your way of operating within communities. But the essence of communities is a combination of individuals. It's an alliance of individuals and a creation of individuals who can align. And I think a big part of that is the listening that we talked about earlier, understanding the objectives of your colleagues and figuring out how to work and live alongside them in a positive way. I'm glad you mentioned wealth. I wanted to write a book that was honest about what it's like to try to build a remarkable life, to be successful, and the role that money plays in that. and the fact that many, but by no means all of us, will at one stage or another feel like we need to make money and to participate in environments where making money is possible. That's not true of everybody. My wife's works in a university. I mean, I know that there are walks of life where it's very difficult to make a lot of money. But I think a lot of the people that I've grown up with, this is a major factor. And what I really wanted people to think about was what's the journey in life? If it's just towards maximizing wealth, then that's unlikely to be truly remarkable. And there are people who, I talk about in the book, who make a lot of money and then decide they want to do something different. But there are equally people who don't maximize their wealth because of the choices they're making along the way. Anyway, it's just a factor. It's one of the motivations. It can be a dominant motivation for some, a less dominant motivation for others. Knowing what matters to you is what really is important.
Yeah, Danny Kahneman reports that if you look at the correlation between happiness and wealth, there is a misery threshold. So you've got a nice line. As your wealth increases, you become happier up to a certain threshold. Surprisingly, it's not that high, the threshold. I think in the United States, no, I've forgotten the figure, so I won't even try to remember it. Above that threshold, there's almost no correlation between wealth and happiness. So it's a sort of, it suggests you want to be above that line. You want to help everybody else get above that line, but after that, don't rely on there being a correlation.
Exactly, and I think a big part of, if you like, what's gone wrong, certainly in America, and to an extreme extent in America, is the system has enabled massive wealth creation well beyond the point that is actually helpful and constructive and makes you happy, but it's skewed everything. And we've seen, statistics recently about, the concentration of wealth, which is just, and again, here's the point that I want to stress on a number of things that I talk about in the book, and that is, these things can change in a generation. They have changed in a generation. The degree of wealth concentration, since we're talking about that at the moment, is order of magnitude higher than it was just 30 years ago. And as a society, we can judge, it can change, and it might go the other way. And these pendulum swings, this swing from generalist to specialist, this swing from reasonably distributed wealth towards massively concentrated wealth, that pendulum can swing back, and I hope it will.
Great. Well, listen, before you join us for drinks just outside this lecture theatre, to which I warmly invite all of you, can you join me in thanking Nick Lovegrove for coming and discussing his book, The Mosaic Principle, with us?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.